Hello and welcome to this video on literary theory, and today we're going to be looking at an introduction to Marxism. So make sure you're taking notes as you watch this video. You might find it particularly useful if you've just finished your GCSEs and you're thinking about what A-level English literature might involve. Okay, so I hope it's helpful for you. First of all, we need to ask, well, what is Marxist literary theory? And I've got a picture of Karl Marx here, who was the figure upon whose theories and ideas this concept is based. So Marxist literary critics explore how writers have represented the class system, examining the struggle of oppressed workers against their oppressors, and exposing what the text reveals about the writer's own social and economic context. So it's a deeply historical approach to looking at literature. And as I've said, it's based on the writings of the 19th century theorist Karl Marx. You might know him for his work, The Communist Manifesto from 1848, his most famous work. And Marxist literary critics might ask questions at the most basic level, such as how does the writer present the working classes in their employment? How does the writer present the bourgeoisie and the methods by which they maintain their power? And does the text challenge or does it maintain class difference? What is its role within the society at the time? So Marx believed that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. And this would have been a radical idea at the time that Marx was writing. What he means by this is that it's your social, political, economic circumstances that determine your life rather than it being the other way around. So I suppose what he's saying is he's echoing Jean-Jacques Rousseau's comment that man is born free but everywhere is in chains, that it's the situation of society that entraps men and takes away their individuality and their liberty. So for example, if we think about a literary text, Eva Smith's life in An Inspector Calls is determined entirely by the situation that she's born into. And Priestley draws attention to this by continually paralleling Eva with Sheila, whose existence is entirely different. So throughout the text, for example, both Eva and Sheila are described as being very pretty, and that word is used as a motif in order to draw those links between them. And by the end of the play, what we realise is that if Sheila had been born in Eva's position, the situation would have been exactly the same for her. And if Eva had been born in Sheila's position, again, the situation would have been the same, because they've both been shaped entirely by the society that they've been brought up into. And I suppose this is what we mean when we talk about them as being victims of society. Eva's situation is determined by the economic drive for her to earn money, so she has to leave the countryside and come into the city. She's following that flow of people during the industrial period and that increase in urbanisation as people were drawn into the city by financial imperatives. Eva's desire, I suppose, to challenge the system then leads to severe economic consequences for her, and that system says, no, absolutely not, you are going to stay in your place. And then Eva, I suppose, is reduced to that kind of very low level, she's absolutely at the brink of survival for most of the play. Sheila, similarly, born into an upper class family, and when she tries to challenge the system, so when she speaks up against her father, again the system kind of reacts against her rebellion and says, no, you're not going to challenge me. And then at the end of the play, the question as to whether that rebellion is going to succeed is left open, because Sheila moves towards the door, but she doesn't go out of it. And when Gerald says, what about this ring? She says, not now, suggesting that maybe in the future she might take that ring. So what we see with these two characters in An Inspector Calls is that the situation, the context that they live in, determines the choices that they're able to make and the existence that they're able to have. Looking a little bit more deeply then at what the theory actually means, Marx argued that our existence is conditioned by economic structures, as we've just looked at on the previous slide. And in the increasingly industrial world in which he was writing, so remember he wrote during the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution was at its height. And at that time, these economic structures primarily included the means of production of goods in factories and the politics and economics that regulated that production. And the legal and political structures of society allow this to continue, and they facilitate the domination of what we call the bourgeoisie over the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, we'll look at definitions on the next slide, but being the people in power, and the proletariat being the working classes, the people who actually work in the factories. And within the modern capitalist society, the individual is therefore not free. He is exploited at all levels. And the reality of the industrial system is oppressive. So the workers, for example, become cogs in a machine. So Eva Smith is just part of a machine, and her individuality has no importance whatsoever to Mr. Burling and to the system that he symbolises within that play. And the workers don't produce a completed product themselves, but what they actually do is make parts of it which are going to be assembled later. And the fact that they don't craft a single object devalues their work and their intelligence as well. They also have no role in the design of what they're doing. Again, that's a separate process completed by a separate person. And so within this machine, they become dehumanized, and they're thought of as objects, dispensable, as Mr. Burling dispenses with Eva in An Inspector Calls, rather than as being human beings. And that's the significance of what Sheila says. She says they're not cheap labour, they're people. And it's her realisation at that point of the play that actually the capitalist system, the industrial system, is dehumanising and devaluing the workers, and that what we need to do is to reclaim their individuality and their humanity. And religion played a key role in this for Marx. So Marx believed that religion itself was a product of human consciousness, that it's a social construct. And we talked about what social construct meant in the last video on feminism. And so Marx, in this very famous phrase, describes religion as being the opium of the people. So essentially it's something that drugs people. It keeps them quiet, it keeps them compliant, because what they're being taught by religion is that God created the world this way, God wanted it to be this way, therefore stay in your place and don't rebel against it. And this situation then leads to antagonism between the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, and the proletariat, the working classes. And for Marx, the concept of class struggle was very important. And this can eventually, in some contexts, lead to revolution. And so we see the Russian Revolution as being the kind of realistic, the physical outworking of lots of Marxist theory. Key terms that you're going to need then if you're writing from a Marxist perspective. So class consciousness, first of all, the beliefs that an individual holds about their economic and class position in society. Capital, so this is where capitalism comes from. Capital is assets that allow an individual to complete their work. So in capitalism, capital is money which is accumulated by the dominant class. So, for example, in a feudal society, your capital might be your animals, it might be the tools that you use in order to work with them and to create objects. Within capitalism, money itself is that asset, and it's traded, it's bartered, it's used in the stock market in order to accumulate more money. And then that in capitalism is all held by a small number of individuals, and they give a very small amount as payment to the working class. The economic base is the means of production which shapes society. So, for example, have you got an industrial economic base? Then we have the superstructure, which is everything else. So politics, law, media, education, art, and all of these maintain the means of production. So, for example, if we're talking about literature as being part of the superstructure, does the literature that we read challenge or does it reinforce this capitalist system that we're living within? An ideology is a set of beliefs or values, often characteristic of a particular group. Alienation is another new word for us, and that's feeling separated from one's society, one's work, or one's sense of self. And I suppose Eva feels this in the factory. She completes one process in the long kind of creation of a product that's coming out of the factory at the other end, but she's alienated from that product because all she sees is one little step in the process that she repeats over and over and over again. And then that, of course, leads to an alienation from your sense of self. It leads to a sense of worthlessness and a lack of value in what you're doing with your life. The bourgeoisie are the owners of that means of production, so Mr. Burling is part of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat are the workers, particularly employed in manual labour. And then we have a revolution, which is a radical radical transformation of the economic and political situation, and it generally or always involves a redistribution of power. So what might a Marxist interpretation actually look like then? Well, here I've taken one of the poems that's on the A-level course for AQA, and it's Keats's poem Isabella, and I'm posing the question, to what extent is Keats's Isabella a poem about class divisions? Because often we look at it through the lens of tragedy or through feminism and so on, but here we're going to look at it through a Marxist lens. Well, the poem itself centres around the love of Isabella and Lorenzo. And at the start of the poem, Keats situates these characters very specifically within a social and economic context. And he says that Isabella is an upper-class woman from an industrial family, so I suppose they're new money, a little bit like the Burlings. And Lorenzo is a lower middle-class man, so he works, he's employed by Isabella's family, and he's deemed by her family not to be wealthy enough to marry her. So here we have a very clear class division established at the start of the poem. And Isabella's brothers take matters into their own hands. When they realise that Isabella is completely in love with Lorenzo, they decide to murder him in order to prevent the marriage going ahead. So they use violence in order to secure their position within the economic and class system, and they do their best to prevent any disruption of this system so that they can maintain the profits that they're going to have, because Isabella herself is a commodity. She's an object within this capitalist system that can be bartered, that can be sold in order to link different companies together or in order to get money from the family that she marries into. And the description of the brothers foregrounds their misuse of economic and class power, and it can be interpreted as a critique from Keats's point of view of the embryonic capitalist system. So here in the box you can see one of the stanzas from the poem which describes the brothers and the factories that they own. And it says, "With her two brothers this fair lady dwelt, enriched from ancestral merchandise. And for them many a weary hand did swelt in tortured mines and noisy factories, and many once pride-quivered loins did melt in blood from stinging whip. With hollow eyes many all day in dazzling river stood, to take the rich o'er driftings of the flood." So we have a juxtaposition here between the fair lady and that adjective fair indicates her upper class situation. She's not tainted by the difficulties, the problems of the working day. They have ancestral merchandise, so it suggests that they're old money as well as being new money with the factories. And it talks here about a weary hand did swelt. Now here the hand refers to the workers in the factory, but through the use of synecdoche, so synecdoche is when the part of something is used to represent the whole thing, so for example the crown represents the royal family, so here just the hand represents the workers, and it's really interesting which part of the body Keats has used to represent the working classes. So it's not their brain, it's not their heart, so it's not their intelligence or their individuality, their feelings, their emotions, anything like that. It's their hands, so the part of the body which is able to complete the work. And this indicates that these factory hands, these workers, within this capitalist society are only valued because they're able to complete a production process. And the brothers don't want them to think or anything like that, so they do simply become cogs in a machine here. And then we've got the tortured mines, the noisy factories, we've got the blood, the stinging, the hollow eyes. And so these words here show the impact that the capitalist system can have on the individual. There's a huge amount of intense physical and emotional suffering here. So the hollow eyes, we're moving from the hands to the eyes, and the eyes are often talked about as being the windows to the soul. So when Keats is talking here about the eyes, what he's giving us is a picture of the extreme suffering that these factory workers are going through, and that adjective hollow shows their dehumanization, their alienation from themselves, from their work, their lack of interest in what they're doing has been stripped away from them by their economic situation. And then we have the juxtaposition of the dazzling river with the suffering of these men. So what Keats is saying here is that the natural world should be so amazing, it should be valued, we should be working with it. Whereas actually all the brothers are doing is looking at this dazzling river, this beautiful scene, to take from it. And the simplicity of that verb take, in contrast to the beautiful connotations of the word dazzling, is really stark. You know, all these brothers are in this for is to take. And the rich oared driftings, well, in Keats, if we're talking about richness, we often start to look at the beauty of the natural world, how much we can appreciate that as an individual, how it can heal the soul and provide solace to someone who's upset. But actually what the adjective rich means here is simply financial. It's purely what the brothers can get from it. So the tragedy, arguably, of Keats's poem is actually that individual feelings are unable to overcome the power of the economic system. And pathos is felt for the characters who find themselves to be simply cogs in a machine. So Lorenzo should simply have fulfilled his role within the business. And then he would have been okay. He would have survived, but he would have been alienated from himself, from his lover, from his fulfillment in life. Isabella should have used her beauty as a commodity to secure a more economically suitable marriage. And again, she rebelled against that, and that results in her death within this capitalist world. And Keats's own middle-class background would have rendered him more sympathetic to Lorenzo's situation. And one of the things that Marxist critics do is look at the background, the assumptions, the context in which the writer themselves would have existed. As I said, Marxism is often quite a historical endeavour. Looking then at a text that you might be more familiar with from GCSE, I've got another question here. And the question is, to what extent is Jekyll and Hyde a novel about class conflict? Well, throughout Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson's critique of the hypocrisy of the upper classes is clear. And this is an idea that we're really familiar with from our GCSEs. So the upper classes maintain a facade of respectability during the day whilst indulging in questionable activities at night time. And if you did A Christmas Carol for GCSE, again we've got this facade of respectability that Scrooge and other people in the upper classes try to maintain, whilst they're actually using that facade to, not so well in Scrooge's case, hide the fact that actually for them it's all about what they can gain. Despite this, arguably the only sense of humanity and individuality in Jekyll and Hyde is found in the presentation of middle and upper class characters. For example, for all his flaws and dark secrets, Mr. Utterson is portrayed as genuinely loyal and considerate to others. And this is one situation in which Stevenson really differs from Dickens. Dickens often presents the working classes as being compassionate, as being loving, as being caring, as being very moral characters, whereas for Stevenson, really the only character of any kind of depth or quality I've been able to find in Jekyll and Hyde that at any point shows these characteristics is Mr. Utterson, or I suppose Dr. Lanyon as well. Shows a level of compassion towards Jekyll, but again he's an upper middle class character as well. So if we look at how the working classes are described by Stevenson, they really don't fare very well. They're presented as violent, weak, hypocritical, or simply lacking in intelligence. So looking at these quotations here, at the start of the novel, during the incident when Hyde tramples a little girl, a lot of women come out of the houses and they start trying to attack Mr. Hyde. And Enfield describes, all the time as we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. There's no sense of humanity really here in the description of these women. You know, Stevenson doesn't seem to recognise that actually a terrible crime has taken place which has attacked the child of one of these women, and therefore that this response is potentially quite natural. What Stevenson actually does, or what Enfield actually does, is to reduce these women to a homogeneous group, a circle of faces. He doesn't look at the individuality of these people, he just describes them as having quite an immoral and unjustifiable level of anger. And then after that, we meet the landlady that Hyde rents from, and Stevenson describes that she had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. So like all of the upper class characters, this landlady has a facade of hypocrisy about her. And then at the end of the text, Poole goes to get Mr. Utterson to get him to come and help them dealing with Dr. Jekyll. And it's interesting because even Poole requires the increasingly paternalistic figure of Utterson to tell him what to do at the novel's conclusion. Poole doesn't isn't presented as having the intelligence to be able to work out what he should do himself. He's presented as needing someone from the upper middle classes, the upper classes, to guide him and to be that paternalistic figure. And then the final quotation I've got here: at the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson," ran forward as if to take him in her arms. So you could look at this from a feminist perspective and talk about how the women are being presented as very weak in the novel and so on. Or you could look at this from a Marxist perspective, or link the two together and say that actually this description fits in with Stevenson's depiction of the working classes throughout the novel as being weak, as being over-emotional, as being just generally lacking in intelligence. So therefore, while Stevenson's text is indiscriminate in that it finds evil and debasement at all levels of society, it fails to recognise any positive qualities amongst the proletariat. There's no sense of individuality, there's no depth of character there among these working class figures. So we could question, I suppose, Stevenson's understanding of the different classes. And to go back to the question that I posed at the start of this slide, to what extent is Jekyll and Hyde a novel about class conflict? Well, I suppose my answer after thinking that through is that it's not really, because the working classes just follow what the upper classes do. They just follow in their steps, and actually none of them really challenge the system that they're living within. So as you're thinking about your own Marxist interpretations, then you might want to ask yourself some questions. So firstly, how is the proletariat portrayed in the novel or the text? Do they accept their role, or do they attempt to challenge it? And is that successful or not? Does the writer's own historical context make them sympathetic or otherwise to this class? So thinking about Elizabeth Gaskell's novel North and South, which I really recommend you read, or there is a TV adaptation as well, Gaskell depicts the struggle of the working classes to achieve a fair wage through a series of strikes. So you could examine how these workers are presented and how Gaskell garners sympathy for their plight. So unlike Stevenson, Gaskell really humanises these working class characters and presents the dreadful situation that they're in. And the point of the novel is really clear. She's trying to tell the ruling classes of the day that we shouldn't be treating the working classes like this. We have to treat them with a level of dignity. We have to give them more support. We have to give them more economically sound situations. On the other hand, the ending of the text seems to suggest that the solution for this is a benign class system. So there's no convincing challenge to the class system in itself. The heroine of the novel marries the factory owner, and they're just generally a bit nicer to the people around them than they were at the start, but there's no challenge to the class system. You could also ask yourself, how are the bourgeoisie presented in the novel? Does the text explore and challenge power relations? And so for this question, Dickens is really good, and again I really recommend that you spend some time reading Charles Dickens. His novels contain characters from all walks of life. His presentation of the struggles of the working class are at times profoundly moving. I'm sure you've all seen the musical version of Oliver Twist. You know, we really feel a lot of sympathy for the working class characters in his novels. And that could itself come out of Dickens's background as well, if you look into that in more detail. At times, or quite frequently actually, Dickens critiques the hypocrisy and the selfishness of the upper classes, so if you think about the Dedlock family in Bleak House. However, like in Gaskell's novels, many of Dickens's heroes and heroines settle in an upper middle class position, dispensing charity and kindness to those around them. And so we have to ask, does this actually challenge the injustices of the class system, or does it actually continue that class system? Because what we say is, it's okay if you give charity. If you're nice to the working classes, that makes it okay. In contrast, we could look at George Orwell's novels, his Dystopia 1984, also Huxley's Brave New World, both amazing novels, and they explore how power in society is maintained by the bourgeoisie through language, through education, through surveillance. And finally, you could think about, how does the writer present concepts of revolution or change to the class system? Going back to George Orwell, his allegorical novella Animal Farm seems to suggest that whilst revolution can lead to positive change, ultimately humanity's lust for power and control means that the class system will inevitably re-emerge. And in his historical text, Homage to Catalonia, Orwell also explores socialism with all its flaws as well as its benefits. And so the question that Orwell is asking, I suppose, is socialism the answer to this class struggle? Will it provide the solutions? Or is there some quality in humanity, that lust for power, that drive for control, which will always cause capitalism or capitalist type structures to re-emerge? Now, my readings of these texts, my interpretations of these texts on this slide are very reductive, I suppose. I'm only looking at it really from one lens, and I'm just trying to pose questions to get you thinking. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been really useful for you. My next video in this series is going to be on the literary canon.